This is Where We Live on Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. Over the last few weeks, we've had members of the Black and Puerto Rican Caucus on the show to talk about several issues, including the legalization of cannabis. And today we scheduled the vice chair of the caucus, State Representative Bobby Gibson. He's represented Bloomfield and part of Windsor since 2018. Now, with live radio, sometimes what we plan doesn't exactly pan out. So right now, we are waiting to hear from State Representative Bobby Gibson, who confirmed that he would be on the show today, and he has not yet connected. So we hope to have that conversation with Representative Bobby Gibson soon. And if you are if he represents your town of Bloomfield or part of Windsor, if there are questions or issues happening in your community and you want to ask that question, we want you to join as well. Here's the number, 888-720-9677. That's 888-720-WNPR. You can also find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. I believe Representative Gibson has finally connected. Representative, can you hear me? It looks like Representative Gibson, you're muted. If you could unmute and we can start the show. Can you hear me now?
All right. Can you hear me?
Yes. Representative Gibson, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. How are you?
I'm doing well. Well, we're glad that you were able to join us, and we definitely want to talk to you about your role in the Black and Puerto Rican Caucus, as well as the time that you have represented Bloomfield and part of Windsor. So remind us, some of the lawmakers I speak to have been in the General Assembly for a long time. You were elected, I believe, by special election in 2018, and you've been a long-time educator. Tell me what drew you to the General Assembly.
Well, thank you. That's actually a good question. But I first have to say good morning once again, and I apologize for being a little tardy. I'm going to have to give myself a detention. But actually what happened is we started summer school, and the custodians didn't know in my school that I had this interview this morning. And so they started moving stuff around, and it started a little bit of a problem. But I'm settled now, and thank you for having me. So, so I am an educator. I'm an administrator at the Carmen Aries Middle School in Bloomfield. And you can hear the intercom there. What happened was I was a long time educator and coach. And so I spent many years coaching athletes in just about every sport, track, football, basketball. And I dedicated my life to that. And so by doing that, I really got to know my community. I got to know the state. I got to know the people in which I served as both a coach and a educator. And then when it came time for me to move on from coaching, I knew there were a lot of topics and ideas that needed to be addressed in my community. And so when the opportunity came for the state representative seat in Bloomfield, Windsor to be vacated, the former state representative became a judge. I decided it was my time to serve, and so I'm glad I did.
So let's talk about your work within the General Assembly related to some major issues that have passed through the legislature this last session. Let's start with legalizing cannabis. I understand you actually voted against this bill. I know when you were elected, this cannabis issue has been before the legislature for several years. And so you have said that, it's important to have communities of color as part of this discussion. And I wanted to know why you eventually voted no on this particular bill.
So it depends on what hat you put on, what lens you look through. I have to say that the first and foremost, as I know we're on radio, but I work in a school, and I'm a teacher and administrator. And so it's very hard for me as an administrator, as an educator, to say to my kids, don't do drugs, don't do alcohol, be responsible, live a clean life. As a former science teacher, to teach about nutrition and healthy lifestyles, and then go ahead and support cannabis. So that was big for me, as well as some other issues as far as being a father and some of the things I believe in. I know that it was very important to some folks concerning the equity piece, making sure that the communities that were affected by the war on drugs were given their just due. But when I had to weigh all of my options and really concentrate and meditate on my decision, my role as an educator won out.
When we've spoken with Representative Reyes and other members of the Black and Puerto Rican Commission, I'm sorry, Black and Puerto Rican Caucus, rather, definitely a split within the caucus. Not everybody was on board with this particular issue, but it was something that a majority of members in the caucus ended up supporting. And so, can you talk through some of the discussions that you had about this related to the vote? And, you know, as we now look to how the state's going to implement this, some of the things that you're concerned about or hoping to be addressed as Connecticut moves forward on cannabis?
Well, the biggest thing is that the members wanted a bill that did just to the state, and it wasn't just about the revenue, which you would most often hear. It wasn't just about we're going to be the last because of there's neighboring states who are going to do it, and you just have to drive a couple minutes to say Massachusetts to get cannabis. It had to do with making sure that again the communities that were affected by the war on drugs were giving an equitable look as far as being made whole. It had to do with jobs, not having those who have the top percentage as far as earnings control the cannabis industry in this situation, whereas the top percentage or percentile of folks who earn the most money will benefit from cannabis more so than the communities that were decimated and destroyed by the war on drugs. And there's other factors as well. So a lot of discussion and a lot of thought had to go into what the bill would look like, what the legislation would look like. So I will say that the authors of the bill did a very good job as far as that is concerned. And so, you had to go back and forth. I mean, there's a reason why cannabis is a difficult decision. But when it's all said and done, I think those who voted for it and voted against it did it for the reasons in which they truly believed that they were representing their constituents.
You're still an educator now. Legalization of cannabis is the law in Connecticut. So how do you reconcile that message with your students who may still have questions, or you worry about the message it sends to them, Representative?
That's a very good question. And actually, as we are here this summer preparing for a new school year, that is something that we're going to have to, as educators, address and look at. And, being an educator, I can always say that everything almost starts with education. So it's here. So we have to make sure that as adults and as educators, we hold professional developments to understand totally what is cannabis, what are the chemical makeups that make up cannabis, what are the effects on the body, and sort of like when we teach students about alcohol and alcohol abuse and responsible use, we have to do the same thing with cannabis. So it's about education, and now that it's here, it's about embracing it because it is here, and we want to make sure that our students are well equipped for this new world. So that they can be successful if when they turn a certain age, 21, if they decide to partake in it. And also, since it is here, and we talked about the equity piece, if they decide to get in on the industry, making sure that our students aren't left behind and making sure that they can get a piece of this revenue stream that was voted on.
When you mean that the revenue stream, so the money that goes back into communities to help programs that children and youth may partake in?
Yeah, absolutely. So for example, I can speak from my district here in Bloomfield and Windsor. Bloomfield is a school system that is perhaps in a sense 90s as far as students of color. And I can say as well that we have to make sure that, and from my standpoint, that my students, again, understand the effects of cannabis and what it can do to you. But also, just because I voted no, I now, as a responsible educator, need to make sure my students understand the business side and that they can perhaps, as far as revenues are concerned, benefit from getting in on that industry. So so that they aren't left behind in this whole process.
You're hearing State Representative Bobby Gibson. He represents Bloomfield and part of Windsor. He's vice chair of the Black and Puerto Rican Caucus. If he's your representative, if you have a question for him, you can join us, 888-720-9677. That's 888-720-WNPR. You can share a comment on our Facebook page or find us on Twitter @WhereWeLive. You're also vice chair of the legislature's General Law Committee. This committee oversees the State Department of Consumer Protection. We know DCP is going to be putting a system in place to regulate both cannabis sellers and growers. And so just going back to a previous question I'd asked you, some of the key issues you're going to be watching as this process unfolds, Representative Gibson.
Well, again, making sure that those who decide to get in on the industry are given a fair share, are given a fair shot at becoming growers or sellers. Just making sure that the revenues, as far as where they're supposed to go, are actually going there, and just making sure that the spirit of the legalization is kept pure. Is those who have the most, as far as the top percentile earners in the state, aren't just benefiting.
A part of the work in how this will unfold relates to this equity commission that I believe legislature, the governor, and others all have a role to play in who sits on this commission. Who do you want to see on this panel?
Well, in order for it to be equitable, I think you need to have folks who represent communities that were affected. And so we do have quite a few members of the Black and Puerto Rican Caucus who represent those communities. And we also have members of the Black and Puerto Rican Caucus who were champions for this piece of legislation. So I think it would be imperative that we have legislators who are on the pulse of the communities. We have stakeholders from nonprofits that or community organizations that represent these communities, so that they can make sure that, again, the spirit of the equitable portion of the legislation is carried through.
In the spring, I believe you wrote an op-ed calling for a ban on flavored tobacco products. This bill, there was quite a process in the legislative session, ended up not getting passed. Talk about why you want to see this ban happen in Connecticut and some of the barriers in place.
Well, I'll start with the barriers. I remember having quite a few Zoom meetings, whereas the thought was not instructing adults on what they should do. We should not be telling adults what they can and cannot do. And I felt that statement to be problematic because we do live in a nation of laws, and how we get along and how we live our lives is we're all subjected to laws. And so we're actually when we elect our officials to do the jobs that we do, to come up with laws, we're in essence instructing adults on how to live their lives. So, as you know, the flavored tobacco, the vaping, is something that's not healthy. It's something that can cause various health concerns. And so, when you are exposing your public to flavored tobacco products, when you're exposing your public to cigarettes that are very strong, and you're taking those of us who may not have the stamina or the strength to resist these things, you're causing your society to have higher health risk and health problems. And so why add to that? I can attest, I've taught in various school districts and I've lived in various neighborhoods, inner city and suburbs. And, it's something to go down to a corner store and see a person go to the counter and ask for a Lucy. A Lucy is a loose cigarette. And they ask for these Lucy's, these loose cigarettes, because they can't afford to get a pack of cigarettes. And so they get charged these Lucy's at a higher rate per Lucy, if you will, than if they just bought the whole pack. And so that's a way of keeping people down, and that's a way of taking away again from those who are less of us. The flavor products, those are targeted to those of us, and it's usually students. And again, as an educator, that's the biggest hat I wear outside being a father. You're exposing our students to these things. And so, I've gotten so many calls from constituents who are very happy that I opposed the flavored tobacco products, the cigarettes that are being sold loosely and have an addictive flair to them, because I think it's the right thing to do.
When we talk about how these products have been marketed, especially to communities of color, when you see the way menthol cigarettes are advertised to people in our country, including many Black residents, in your op-ed, you had said, let's make 2021 the year we say no to big tobacco. And now Philip Morris is moving its headquarters to this state. How did you react to that news?
Back years ago, when there was the campaign to end big tobacco, it felt as though it was a step in the right direction. But now it seems like we are going back towards where we started. You'll see more movies and shows now where there's people smoking and where cigarettes are being seen in higher guard and in movies, and you'll see more billboards and you're seeing more signs for smoking, and having tobacco companies move into the state is very problematic and is very concerning, especially since we spend so much time educating our students and educating our public on not to smoke and the dangers of smoking. So it's very concerning, it's very problematic, and it just speaks to the money that's behind big tobacco. And what are we as a society, what are we really listening to? Are we listening to the science? Are we listening and following the education, or are we following the money?
I'm glad you brought up the money, because when this bill was being debated, I believe nonpartisan budget analysts said the state could lose nearly $200 million in tax revenue if there was a ban on menthol cigarettes. I believe Governor Lamont had proposed a ban on flavored e-cigs except for menthol cigarettes. And so that's really at the heart of this issue, isn't it? That while it's not good for people's health, it impacts young people and other communities disproportionately, it always goes back to the money.
Unfortunately, yes, it does. And we will, yes. And so, in order to have a state that is functioning and a society that's taking care of its citizens, yes, we must have money. However, we must also understand, what are we doing to our citizens, and what level of health do we want? What level of a society do we want, as far as making sure that we're taking care of our society. There's more ways and more creative ways to get revenue into the state versus subjecting our citizens to health concerns and health risk. And if you really think about it, I know I mentioned the inner cities and witnessing residents buying these menthol loosies, these cigarettes, and all the vaping products that are out there, the flavored cigarettes and everything. And one of the things that wasn't brought up in the debate by those who are against the ban is that some of these same residents who are getting hooked, who are addicted to the menthol cigarettes, to some of these same residents who are having health concerns from the flavored products, some don't even have adequate health insurance. Some of them don't even have access to a doctor who can help treat them, or a facility that can help treat their addiction. And so what are we doing? We're creating more of a divide in our society between the haves and have-nots, to those who are excelling economically and health-wise versus those who are not. So to be very honest with you, it's a a health and it's a social injustice. It's a economic injustice. And again, just think about who's really being hurt by the sale of these products.
You're hearing State Representative Bobby Gibson, Vice Chair of the Black and Puerto Rican Caucus in the General Assembly. He represents parts of Windsor and Bloomfield. You can join us, 888-720-9677. That's 888-720-WNPR. I want to take a quick caller in from Hartford, Dr. Larry Deutsch. Hello, Larry. What could you like to tell us?
Good morning, and I so much endorse the comments of Bobby Gibson. He speaks as an educator, and I speak as a doctor or pediatrician. And simply to say that it's the root causes, the economics, the profit making that needs attention, and it's first and foremost, however, should be the taking care of society. That's what Bobby said, and the health justice issue in terms of maintaining the health of our communities, and then taking care of economic issues later with justice, but without the profit making and without the stigmatization and the imprisonment, the mass incarceration of those guilty of an infraction of this kind. It's the health he and I and all of us should be concerned with first and foremost of our individuals, whether they be teens or adults. We've got to get rid of these drugs, including nicotine, flavor or not, and cannabis, which is just not bad for the person's lungs inside. Simple as that.
Well, thank you, Larry, for calling in. We're going to be back with State Representative Bobby Gibson after the break. We're going to talk about some other issues that the legislature dealt with this last session. We're going to talk a little bit about the veto of the solitary confinement bill by Governor Lamont, and we'll take your questions too. Again, the number 888-720-9677, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. This is Where We Live on Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. My guest today is State Representative Bobby Gibson. He's on Zoom. He's Vice Chair of the Black and Puerto Rican Caucus, represents Bloomfield and Windsor. If you have a question for him, 888-720-9677. That's 888-720-WNPR, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. We talked about health inequities in the last segment. Let's talk about the wealth inequity in our state. Representative, I know on July 1st, the state's baby bonds program went into effect. The governor signed it a day earlier. This was an idea championed by Treasurer Sean Wooden, supported by your caucus. Tell us how it'll work and why this is so important.
Well, again, I think this session really had to deal with the inequities that were brought forth by the pandemic. And when I say brought forth, we knew that they existed, but they were really brought to the forefront of our consciousness when the pandemic hit and who was affected the most. And to be very honest with you, as we start to exit the pandemic, hopefully, I think we're going to see a different view as far as who's going to benefit from the pandemic. But as far as baby bonds are concerned, it was a great idea from Treasurer Wooden. I take my hat off and applaud him for coming up with it. It was an honor to work with him and to push that very important piece of legislation. And so what it's going to do is when a child is born into our world, and if they have a certain economic standing, whereas they may not be as blessed as some of us are economically, they'll have some money put aside for them. And when they turn 18, this money will be made available. Projections state that it should be around $11,000. Now, for some of the listeners, that may not be a lot of money, but for the majority of us out there, that is a really good start for that individual to be able to go to college, go to a trade school, to have a deposit on a home, or to start a business. It's a step in trying to bridge that gap that we talked about in the first segment in our society. A society that's well educated, a society in which all individuals are doing well, makes for a better society for us all. More people will be able to, like I said, start a business, to contribute to the economy, to purchase a home, to buy different products. And so, it's a trickle down effect or a domino effect, whereas everyone will benefit. So it's a great program. And I'm excited that it passed. And hopefully it will make sure that us as a state continue to climb.
And so just to reiterate the basics, so this program puts a little more than $3,000 into the account for children born to low-income parents. That money grows over time, and as you stated, Representative, it can be used in a variety of ways. But what assurances do we have that the state will continue placing money into these accounts as the years go by?
Well, as it stands right now, there's a certain amount of years, whereas the funds will be there, so that's in law. It's going to have to be revisited at some point in time in the future to make sure that the program continues. But I think what's going to happen is that we're going to start to see the benefit from it, and that the state will move forth. And actually, this is something that on a national level, other states are paying attention to. So as we as a country try to make sure we close these economic gaps, I think that the success of one will be the success of many, and that is something that will continue.
I mentioned earlier we wanted to talk with you about the governor's veto of a bill that would have placed new restrictions on the use of solitary confinement in Connecticut jails and prisons. When the governor vetoed this bill, instead put forth an executive order. He wrote, "I'm not signing this legislation because as written it puts the safety of incarcerated persons and correction employees at substantial risk." So I wanted to get your reaction to that veto and the executive order that he then put forth.
So it's concerning because we spoke to a lot of people who have loved ones in the correctional facilities and how they're treated. And so I think what's going to happen is those who are against the bill are going to have to come forth and speak to us so we can make sure that there's some adjustments to be made. Because as I can speak as the vice chair of the Black and Puerto Rican Caucus, we heard mostly from the families of those who are and who are formerly incarcerated, that someone could be put in solitary confinement for reasons that may not deem really appropriate, and be in there for a substantial amount of time before they're taken out. And that's problematic for me as an educator, because it's when someone commits a crime, they're put into a correctional facility to be corrected. That's what we call it, right? And we have correctional officers. And so what we want to do is we want to make sure that those persons who have committed a crime, they serve their consequence. And when they come out, they're corrected and they have a better way. So, we really have to look at prison reform and how we treat those who are in our society. And we don't have a throwaway society. We have a society where we give second chances. We have a society where we try to have people who have committed these crimes come out and be positive contributors to our society. So again, this still is something that needs to be looked at, something that needs to be adjusted if need be. The talk was we wouldn't have enough correctional officers. Well, perhaps that's something that we need to look at. Maybe we need to have more correctional officers, or again, maybe we need to look at prison reform and how we are treating these people who are incarcerated, making sure that again, when they have served their time, when they serve their consequence, they can be positive contributors to our society and not get caught up in the prison system. And I will end with this. I will talk from being the vice chair of the Black and Puerto Rican Caucus. we have a state whereas people of color are not the majority, but in our prison system, we make up the majority of the inmates, which again is problematic. How could that happen? And so, you have people of color who are being put in solitary confinement. And, again, we've heard a lot of cases why that's a problem.
Today, I believe House leaders from both parties will be meeting to discuss some motor vehicle thefts that have been happening in our state. And I believe some of the people that have perpetrated this are teenagers. We've heard from Republican lawmakers in the House who say that the state needs to put more teeth into the juvenile justice system by allowing young people to be held in detention for longer periods without a court order, also allowing more police chases of stolen cars and making it easier for an underage person to be classified as a risk to public safety. These proposals, these ideas have circulated over the last few years. But what's your take as someone who works with young people? Is the solution to put them away and that solves the problem? It sounds like this is what some of the Republican leaders are saying, that there needs to be stricter punishments for these types of acts.
Yeah, I wish I could have you say that again, but I wouldn't. I'm not going to ask you to do that. I wish that we could have, for the visual learners out there, every time for every word you just said, you could have the words scream across the screen so you can read exactly what you just said. Because maybe that would drive home the solution or why that's problematic as far as people on the other side of the aisle, some of their wants. We have a society whereas we have juveniles, we have youngsters who, for certain reasons, have committed crime, and to put these youngsters in confinement for longer periods of time to make it easier for these youngsters to be put away. Just let that sit in your mind for a second. You have children at the beginning of their lives who have committed some infractions, and there's no one on this planet who is without guilt, who has lived a perfect life. No one. And so to take these youngsters and make it easier to incarcerate, to put them away, what kind of society are we building? What are we doing as far as trying to get these youngsters to be positive contributors to our society? A lot of this has to do with education. A lot of this has to do with funding. A lot of this has to do with programs in which we meet the needs of families and meet the needs of these children. Why are they committing these crimes at a certain age? No one's born a criminal. These are things that are learned, or these are things that are developed based on your social economic situation. So what are we doing as a society to making sure that instead of these individuals, for example, stealing a car, which is horrible, and there's been some horrible things done in these car thefts. But what are we doing in society so these youngsters aren't committing these crimes? Again, I don't think a kid, is born, goes to preschool and kindergarten and says, I want to steal a car. There's something that we're not doing as a society to make sure that we are reaching these kids and making sure that we're educating them and making sure that we're doing what we need as far as meeting their needs to make sure that they're successful. I do believe we have to address crime. Yes, of course. But again, what does it do to take a teenager who is, let's throw out an age, 15 years old, who has stolen a car, keep incarcerating them, getting a record, exposing them to the evils and the bad parts of society? What type of person is that person going to be when they become an adult? Are they going to be a positive contributor to society who is, who can buy a home or a condo, or and have a job and contribute to our economy? Or are they going to have a black mark on them, both mentally as well as their record is concerned, and not be a positive contributor to our society? So as a society, we have to decide what do we want, which direction we want to go.
Last question for you before we head to break. I believe a special session will be scheduled soon on whether to extend the governor's pandemic emergency authority. What's your take on that? Do you think that should be extended, Representative?
Well, let me ask this question. Let me just make the statement. When the pandemic hit, we were in the close proximity to the hottest spots as far as the numbers of COVID cases. And we were able as a state to, regardless of how you view it, regardless if you say it was infringed, your freedoms were infringed on or not, we were able to take care of our society. The COVID numbers didn't spike as they could have, being in close proximity to some of our to bigger states. I think the governor did a great job again in keeping us safe. He did a great job as far as making sure that we got through the pandemic without a lot of harm. And in opening the state, we're opening our state, and again, we haven't seen a lot of outbreaks of COVID cases and spikes. Even with the new variant out there looming, I think we're doing a good job. So you can't make everyone happy, but I think that the governor's usage and us as a legislature monitoring his usage of his executive powers, I think we've done very well with it, and I'm confident that we will continue doing well bipartisanly.
And I should say that the governor said the emergency authority would be helpful in making the state eligible for federal funds. And so we'll have to leave it there. Representative Bobby Gibson, thank you for joining us. And no more detention for you. I think you've done a good job on the show, and we appreciate your time today.
I appreciate it, and thanks for having me. I would love to come back again. This is very helpful, and thank you for your service. As I'm speaking, I'm getting a lot of text messages, so you are reaching a lot of people, and you're doing a very good job. So thank you for what you do.
This is Where We Live. Thank you, Representative Bobby Gibson. Coming up, we're going to get some analysis from CT News Junkie's Hugh McQuaid. He's been covering a lot of issues in our state. And you can join us too. Find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. This is Where We Live. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. Coming up tomorrow, data show downloads of mental health apps rose nearly 200% during the pandemic. On the next Where We Live, we'll take a look at the therapist in your pocket. We hope you join us for that. Now, we just heard from State Representative Bobby Gibson, Vice Chair of the Black and Puerto Rican Caucus in the General Assembly. For more context on some of the issues we brought up, joining us now on Zoom, Hugh McQuaid, who's a reporter for CT News Junkie. Hi, Hugh. Welcome to the show.
Lucy, thanks for having me.
So we started out talking about cannabis, and it's clear that not all members of the Black and Puerto Rican Caucus agreed with the final bill that has become law. It'll be interesting to see how the next steps will shape out. What do you know about when this commission, this equity commission, will be finalized?
Well, last I heard, the House leaders or legislative leaders were looking for people to sort of apply to put on this commission. So the membership, I think, is still in flux a little bit to be determined. It's worth noting, too, that Representative Gibson was not alone in sort of opposing this bill. It was a pretty tight vote in both chambers. I think in the House there was 12 Democrats who voted against it, along with a bunch of Republicans. In the Senate, it came down to 2 votes. And even going back a decade or so, when they decriminalized it in Connecticut and made it a ticket rather than an arrest for small amounts, that vote was a tie vote in the Senate and had to be broken by the lieutenant governor. So historically, this has always been kind of a tough vote for the legislature.
It was interesting to hear from Representative Gibson, because he's an educator, about the message that it sends to young people and the importance of education. Do we know how much money is set aside in this cannabis law that will help with prevention?
I think I'm not sure exactly what the dollar amount is, but I know that that was a subject of debate throughout the session. This bill was it was kind of a moving target all session, and the Black and Puerto Rican Caucus was one of the biggest players in those discussions. So it'll be interesting to see how it all shakes out. They're still working on some of the regulations. The possession of like 1.5 to 5 ounces, depending on the situation, is legal now, but a lot of the recreational and commercial sales aspect of it still have to sort of play out over the next few years,
Including growing at home.
Right. I think it's 2023 before people can grow actual plants in their houses. I think it's, if I remember right, it's 6 plants per individual with a cap of 12. But that's something that, for instance, I think the Black and Puerto Rican Caucus pushed for, that the administration did not want to see in the bill, was that homegrown aspect. So they really did have a huge impact on that bill.
Let's shift to something that's happening today at the state capitol. I'd mentioned Representative Gibson, House leaders meeting to talk about juvenile car thefts. This has been a conversation, an issue that's come up the last several years. Just give us a little background on why they're talking about it today.
Well, as you said, it's been something that was talked about all session. It kind of came up to a head last week. There was an accident in New Britain, which a 53-year-old jogger was killed by police say it was a car driven by a teenager. And come to find out, the teenager had something like 13 arrests in the past 3.5 years, I think. So that sort of put in motion this meeting they're having today. House Republicans put out a press release, and the House Speaker and people on the Judiciary Committee are all coming in to talk about it today.
You have reported on this. You spoke to Ken Barone at CCSU's Institute for Municipal Policy, regional policy as well. So what does the data show when we think about why these car thefts have increased? It's not something that's isolated here in our state.
No, according to Mr. Barone, this is sort of a thing that you're seeing all over the world, not just the country. And he chalks it up to, listen, a lot of kids, they maybe before were in school, and schools went on hold sort of, or was remote for most of last year, and some people never phoned in, right? You have programs that weren't happening, so a lot of young people with time on their hands that I guess got up to trouble. The question for folks now is, what do you do about it, or do you do anything about it? Ken Barone thinks that sort of if you just sort of let things get back to normal, that this will sort of naturally correct itself as programs get back to normal. But it's tough because nobody's arguing. It really has been a problem. It has jumped up this year, so it's sort of hard for legislators to ignore it. You talk to police too. I mean, anecdotally, I've spoken to police officers who say they'll catch some of these kids stealing cars. They'll bring them in, and then a few hours later, they might be back out there doing it. So sometimes I think police feel they don't have adequate tools to sort of address this. But I don't think anybody likes the idea of locking up more kids, right? So it's really a tough call, and we'll see what happens with this meeting. I don't know that I expect a special session on this, but we'll see what they say when it's all over. Well,
when we hear about resources coming into communities, I mean, isn't that part of the discussion as well? When we think about maybe programs to help children at risk before they're getting into this type of activity, what has happened in the pandemic? Have these programs ceased to exist? And what kind of prevention there to help children before they end up having an arrest on their record? Right, yeah.
Actually, even before this accident happened, the governor was out there talking about, he was saying that they were going to spend, I think, $5 million maybe on criminal justice type issues of federal funding that was coming in. And one of the things he talked about was this car theft issue. And another question people sort of are asking about this event that triggered it is this kid apparently had so many, some of the things he was accused of, arrested for, were pretty bad things, like assault with a knife and stuff like that. People are asking why wasn't he in the system already? Because it seems like the way the laws are written now, there's no real reason why he shouldn't have already been detained. But I guess we'll see how it all shakes out.
And lastly, there's a special session coming online, next week to handle this emergency authority extension. This relates to whether the state can continue to receive federal funding. Do you anticipate this is going to pass, Hugh?
Yeah, I would imagine it passes. It's just a question of how, to what extent and for how long. I think the legislature this year passed a bill that sort of curtails a little bit the governor's emergency authority. And part of that is time limits on how long these things can be extended for. And one of those, I think his limit now is 6 months, 180 days. The question is whether or not he'll ask for 180 days or something smaller. And as you said, some federal benefits, I think, are tied to our declaration status. I think people say it comes down to SNAP benefits. Republicans are arguing that you could sort of have a more tailored declaration to just apply to that. But, we'll see what happens. The governor says he wants to keep in place some other stuff, like the mask mandate for people who are not vaccinated indoors in public, some sort of flexibility to do vaccination testings, that kind of thing. So we'll see what happens. But I think that we'll hear something from his office probably this week, and then maybe next week they'll come in and debate that.
You've been hearing Hugh McQuaid. He's a reporter for CT News Junkie. We'll be sure to tweet out some links to your reporting as well as your colleagues. Hugh, thanks for the context. We appreciate it.
Oh, thanks for having me, Lucy.
This is Where We Live. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. Our show today produced by Matt Dwyer with help from Robin Doyen Aiken. Our technical producer is Kat Pastor. We'll be back tomorrow. Thanks for listening.